when I was thinking about public intellectuals and the kind of classic as an author of essays and books, I realized that that's, in some sense, an old school form of media, right? Which is to say, there's other forms of media, and that media is to some degree, the form that public intellectuals can operate in. And I said, well, actually, software is transforming the world, and there is all kinds of different ways that software affects how we think of ourselves, how we communicate, how we form an image of how the world works, and how we connect with each other. And so I was like, well, haven't ever really thought about being a business person. And by the way, even being an entrepreneur at that time, he said, you will be an entrepreneur. I was like, oh, I guess, right? Like, it was only years after I had started LinkedIn, which is kind of the third startup, that I was like, oh yes, entrepreneur is a word that describes me. Like, I understand that that's a word that applies to me, but that wasn't like my goal was to be an entrepreneur. What I realized is that actually creating software products could actually have this similar kind of public intellectual impact. And if it didn't have as much of an impact as I'd like, maybe I could make enough money that I could then not need to fund myself I could essentially not need a salary, and so therefore I could become a public intellectual writing myself. And so it's kind of a plan A and a plan B. And so I came back from Oxford, first time since maybe since I was in junior high. I didn't have a structured strategic plan that I knew exactly what I was going to do. It was like, I need to come figure out this software thing in Silicon Valley. And so I came back without any concrete plans. And at my second week of living at my dad's house, he's like, okay, so you're going to go get a job now, right? And I'm like, well, I was going to research a whole lot. He's like, why don't you research while you get a job? And I was like, oh, okay. And so I was fortunate. This is one of the things where, I had some of the theory pieces of the fact that we live and work in a networked age now, and maybe I had some good instincts about that, but I just started calling my friends and saying, okay, where's a good place to work? And one of my close friends, a gentleman named Stefan Heck, his roommate, Jesse Ellenbogen, was working at Apple at the time. And he said, oh, well, what do you think about Apple? And I was like, oh, Apple's a great company. And so Stefan put Jesse and I in touch with each other, and my first job ended up being at Apple Computer. One of the things, the group I was working in was called the eWorld group. Most people think that meant electronic world. Actually, it was employee world, because it was originally funded for the replacement of a very innovative early program in Apple called AppleLink. And then they suddenly realized it was an online revolution, so they pivoted. But they pivoted essentially without a lot of strong backing from the company. The company really wanted a replacement for AppleLink. They hadn't made a decision to engage in online services. And so it kind of taught me that if you didn't have the right coherent strategy, that at least you knew what you were going to, even if you were pivoting and changing, you had to buy into that. It would lead to a lot of artifacts that would cause the project to fail. And this is actually one of the things that causes a lot of big company projects to fail, because if they don't have essentially enough of a mandate to both have the initial strategic target and the changes and pivots that need to happen along with it, usually those projects fail pretty badly. And eWorld was basically a failure, although because another mentor of mine there, James Isaacs, had during the negotiations said, okay, well, they licensed the America Online platform. They said, look, let's throw in this term that we're not really interested in, because we'll allow it to be negotiated out, because one of the negotiation tactics is to throw in a set of terms so you can remove them in order to get other things that you want. So they asked for 5% warrants in America Online, and as it turned out, that condition stuck, and the warrants in America Online had become so valuable that was more valuable than the entire cost of the eWorld project. So at the end of the day, even though Apple shut it down, they actually made money on the whole project. When I was at Oxford and I realized that software might be an interesting medium for pursuing public intellectual, I knew that what I was interested in software was essentially how we kind of understand ourselves and our identity, how we understood other people, how we understood our relationship, how we shaped the world, how we communicated with people, how we collaborated with people. And I had exposure to the internet from Stanford because I'd interned at the Center for Study of Language and Information. I'd done the computational course with symbolic systems. Now, it was just before the commercialization of the internet. And so when I came out, I originally was thinking I was going to design, this is an old school term, personal information managers. I was going to work on those sorts of products, the way of doing this. And within about a month of being here, I had realized that America Online was growing. CompuServe was beginning to be paid attention to. Prodigy, as most young people today would be, I have no idea what I'm talking about with everything other than maybe America Online. And I realized the online revolution was the area that I would want to participate. And in particular was because when you thought about my interest, the network era of we are all in a network together, and what becomes possible was precisely the kind of thing that I wanted to help shape. And I had a whole stack of ideas on it. I was young and novice and inexperienced as a business person or as an entrepreneur. And so how do you form a business? Like what product ideas, that was relatively straightforward, although there was still a lot of learning there. But how do you start a company? How do you get financing? How do you have a business model? Now, the fortunate thing about early consumer internet is that everyone was fairly novice in this because there were different business rules, there were different ways you did customer acquisition, there were different technologies at play. And so anyway, I had realized that the way the capital markets work is they're either kind of open for a specific sector, in which case, as a first-time entrepreneur, you can get financing, or they're closed, in which case it's very difficult unless you have some very deep, seasoned experience. And so I worked through my job at Apple very quickly. I worked through my job at Fujitsu very quickly because I realized that I didn't know how long the capital markets would stay open, and I needed to go and try to start a company and get some new product ideas out. And so I quit my job at Fujitsu in July of '97, and my first company, SOCIALNET, was financed in November of 1997. It was called SOCIALNET. Actually, it was called relationships.com at the time, and I later renamed it to SOCIALNET when I realized I wanted something that was more broad than just a dating service in terms of concept. So part of what happened, so the PayPal story to LinkedIn is fun because in August of 2000, PayPal burned $12 million in 1 month and didn't really have a dime of revenue, and the cost curve was exponentiating. So Peter, Max, and I did a offsite for Labor Day weekend, I think it was. It was one of the weekends in September, where we spent 3 days. First day was, what's our strategy for how we change course for PayPal? Because we could chart the mushroom cloud from the plowing into the side of the mountain. We could almost chart it by the hour when we would blow up. And we decided to be a master merchant. And fortunately for us and for the world, that turned out to be a good strategy, and it worked because we had one. We used a lot of Star Wars metaphors, the attack on the Death Star, one shot in the trench, because it was like we had one strategy we could play, and other than that, we didn't have time. So the kind of the foundation of LinkedIn is the insight that every individual, whether a student or Bill Gates, having a public professional identity that helps you navigate your world of work, what you're particularly seeking to do, is extremely helpful. And it's helpful both on an inbound basis, because one of the truths about living and working in the networked age is that you have to have a strategy for how you're found, and then how the right signal gets through to you in being found, because there are millions of people out there. So you have to think each CPU processor, each agent, each person. How do you get found by the right person, the right people, and how do you do business with them? And then also, how do you find the right people? How do you find expertise? How do you find business opportunities? How do you find jobs? How do you find how to invest in yourself? And both of those are through the network as a fabric, as a foundation. And so I realized my time at SOCIALNET, talking to Peter and Max at PayPal, that this would be that one of the fundamental ways to transform people's lives is to enrich their economic opportunity, to enrich their ability to either work, to start companies, to navigate whatever economic life is important to them, and that would be a worthy goal of, 12 plus years of my life and still going. Even today, most people coming to LinkedIn don't really realize how strong the tools are. Because most people, when they think I look for work, they go, we have job listings on LinkedIn. They go and look at the job listings. It's a perfectly valid thing to do. But the really interesting thing is to say, well, who do you know who is, in our language of LinkedIn, 2 degrees away from you, who can help give you guidance, who can say, well, this company is a good place to work, or there's this opportunity here. I mean, it goes all the way back to my work. My business career started with a call to a Stanford friend whose roommate was working at Apple. How do you discover those opportunities? Well, that all comes from your network. And so even today, with well over 300 million people on LinkedIn, most people have yet to learn how to use their network in order to ally with their network in order to find the right economic opportunities. And that's some of the things that I'm still working on, we're still working on. Anyway, it's a long ways to go still. One of the very good pieces of advice that my freshman advisor at Stanford gave me in order to figure out a major was to read through courses and degrees and circle the courses that I had to take before I left, and then figure out what the coherent pattern was. And what I realized, my central interest was how we as people, as humans, think, speak, reason, communicate, understand each other. And so at Stanford, that led me to the major that was called Symbolic Systems, which is this kind of medley of computer science, philosophy, linguistics, psychology, some mathematical logic. That's pretty much the set of it. And while I was doing that, I realized that we didn't have very good models for what it was to think, what it was to speak, what it was to understand each other. And so I got more interested in philosophy as a possibility for understanding how we kind of form images of the world, how it is possibly we can communicate. And that's where the specific kind of scholarly interest in philosophy came from. Now, that all being said, when I left Stanford, my primary thought was I was going to become an academic. And the class that I most wanted to teach was a meaning of life class. And you could call that philosophy as well, although that's not what professional academic philosophers would think of as philosophy. But I also have that kind of broad interest in kind of what is the human experience, what is the meaning of human life. Through high school, I read a lot of science fiction. So Frank Herbert and Dune and Orson Scott Card and Ender's Game, and it's kind of the imagination of what might humanity evolve to? What it defined to be humanities? Because the great science fiction is awesome. There's a lot of not so good science fiction as well. And then once I got to Stanford, and another important reason I selected Stanford is they have a program called Structured Liberal Education, which is this kind of 2/3 of your freshman year is spent studying a combination of philosophy, history, art, and in the movement, back when I was there, it was called Western civilization, although structured liberal education already hit the world civilization. So you would read Chinese philosophers and a number of others. And at that point, I started realizing that people were writing essays about what the meaning of life is, how it is that we should live a good life. And at that point, there's a set of the classics. There's, everything from Greek philosophers to Chinese philosophers. But perhaps the book that most people wouldn't have heard of that had a fairly big impact on me when I was a freshman was a media critic named Neil Postman, who wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Television. And I began to realize that the structural means of communication, the structural means of the Marshall McLuhan, kind of the median is the message, actually shaped our identity, shaped how we perceived the world, how we perceived each other, and how we came to judgments about what is truth. And that's where I started getting interested in how kind of thought and language were important, how the way that we communicate and the medium by which we communicated, we crafted messages was extremely important to a better life. I still think we have a long way to go on networks and marketplaces. So whether they're payments networks, social networks, made some investments in Bitcoin as a really out there kind of currency network. And Bitcoin may be huge. And also marketplaces like Airbnb and others. The sharing economy, in terms of sharing resources, what that means for transport with companies like Uber and Lyft. Now, there's still a ton more to come there. There's some very interesting things, I think, coming in the intersection of networks and biology and computation, whether it's personalized medicine, targeting health by genetics, being able to actually even modify genetics. So if you had a genetic condition that was predisposition to extreme ill health, you might actually, there's this technology called CRISPR that might be able to both understand it and also change it. There's, I think, a lot of transformation of education coming through networks. You've got everything from the Khan Academy to, one of my investments, Edmodo, is a social network for K-12. That's what I mean. There's more social networks. And so I think there's to use a baseball metaphor, it may very well be that we're in inning one still.